maybe it is good morning for some participants. We will start now, I think. Hello, everyone. I hope my voice can be heard for all of you. And I hope all of you are safe with good health and full of energy today. Today's webinar will be on the global conduct for safe, orderly, and regular migration. We'll talk about failures and success, especially in Africa. First question, why this webinar is being held nowadays or today? Because this topic was raised in the currently 69th regular session of the African Commission for Human and People's Rights, which Maat participated in. We participated in a panel discussion which discussed and came out with a very important recommendation regarding the role of NGOs in the advocacy to make African governments ratify, join, and implement GCM. So this webinar is a part of the advocacy needed. However, Maat cannot implement this advocacy alone. No, sir. No, madam. Advocacy needs networking and collaboration with experts. So today we have the honor to collaborate with Mrs. Christina Mejo, the Senior Regional Liaison and Policy Officer for the International Organization for Migration, IOM, for Middle East and North Africa. Her portfolio covers migration policy, UN reform, and supporting the IOM mission and presence in the MENA region. Christina has worked over 17 years with IOM serving in Bangladesh, Belgium, Colombia, Egypt, and Burundi. So, Christina, welcome and good evening. We also have, I think, Christina, is Mr. Loran participating with us now?
I don't see him online as of yet.
Yes, me too. Okay. Mr. Loran, the head of the IOM mission in Egypt, preferred to participate as an observer in this webinar, but he's not online. So we will proceed until he joins us. We are also honored to have Dr. Eric Shabandi. He is the director of the Institute for Research and Dialogue for Peace from Rwanda. He is the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Social and Political Administrative Sciences and works at the Center of Conflict Management at the University of Rwanda. So he is participating as an academic and as an NGO representative. We also honored to have Mr. Khaled Boudilli, the chair of the International Peace Key Association for Development and Solidarity in Morocco. And he is the Vice President of the Economic, Social, Cultural Council, African Union, ECOSOC, for North Africa region. He is the representative of multinational investment group Marietta. He is considered one of the most prominent actors in Morocco who are concerned with the issue of the African migrants, especially in Morocco, and the need to improve and settle the conditions of African migrants and refugees in Morocco. Welcome and good morning.
Good morning, sir. Good morning and good morning, everyone. It was a pleasure and I'm honored to be here with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm also happy to introduce my colleague, Mehnatullah Abdurraouf. She is the Vice Chairperson of the Board of Trustees, Maat, Association for Peace Development and Human Rights. She is very specialized in the international human rights mechanism in Vienna, Switzerland, and New York. So welcome to you, Mena, and good evening.
Thank you, Abdurrahman, for the introduction, and welcome also to the honorable panelists joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome to you all. And so I will start by like a small introduction, and then I will leave the floor to Mrs. Christina to start. All of us know that the deteriorating conditions of that migrants and refugees suffer from have become alarming, especially since the issue of migration affects governments, the private sector, and local communities, among the other countries' individuals. In the context of extraditing migration crisis, the United Nations General Assembly approved the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration (GCM) in December 2018. This document sets out 23 goals designed to achieve multilateral cooperation in managing global migration. This has drawn the attention of actors in African continent, including the African Commission for People's Rights, which put the issue of migration at the top of the agenda for the 60-month session, especially in the light of failure of many African countries to contain this crisis due to the economic and health challenges, especially after COVID-19 pandemic. So I will stop here. I must give the floor for our panelists. So we'll start with Christina. Good morning. Good evening. Christina, as an expert, could you please introduce the Global Compact for Migration? Tell us more about your evaluation vision of the GCM after 3 years of its application. So we'll have the floor for maybe 15 or 20 minutes.
Thank you very much for that and for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here and to be connected with you virtually across the many locations. I do have a presentation that I would kindly ask my colleague, Ms. Amira, to present to help display, to help guide us in terms of the discussion points. I take note of the 15 minutes to cover both in terms of the introduction of the GCM, as well as looking at its successes and opportunities and challenges as well for the future. So thank you very much for that. And next slide. In terms of the introduction for the GCM, as you mentioned in the opening, it is compiled of 23 objectives, each with associated commitments and for activities or commitments at the national, local, really, national, regional, and global commitments. It's an aspirational document. It's looking in terms of where would migration be, not necessarily where it is today, but where we hope to see it in 20 years from now. It looks at it at a 360-degree approach, so looking at migration as part of origin, transit, and destination, so the full migration cycle, if you will. It is state-led, looks at it through the lens of a whole of government, noting that migration is also dealt not necessarily with one ministry, but multiple different ministries that address on issues of migration, as well as whole of society. So looking at a wide range of stakeholders that are defined in paragraph 44 of the GCM General Assembly resolution, which includes that of civil society, national human rights institutes, private sector, in terms of academia, and a wide NGOs and wide other number of actors, parliamentarians, among others, that compiles of that of whole of society. It's people-based, rooted in also the basis of target 10.10 of the Sustainable Development Goals, seeking to ensure that migration is safe, orderly, and responsible. And it is ultimately a non-binding document, although based on much international law, but itself is a non-binding document. Next slide, please. It's also noted that the GCM implementation, there's not one size that fits all. So GCM as a whole can be applied in terms of between the 23 different objectives. What are the priorities for each country? It respects the national sovereignty of each country as well. And it works in terms of how can migration management, and the first internationally recognized migration management document to be recognized as a whole by the majority of members, General Assembly member states. It also is being implemented then through the support of what's established called the UN Network on Migration. The UN Networks on Migration are established either at country level, at the regional level, and globally to help member states to implement the objectives of the GCM. And again, it is in efforts to have system-wide coordination of the UN to implement all and support the government on the implementation of the GCM. There was also a capacity building mechanism that has been established to help member states, again, to achieve the objectives of the GCM as part of the Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund. There's equally been an establishment of a migration hub, or in terms of a one-stop shop to be able to find experts information on migration and serve as a global knowledge platform. And equally as part of both the GCM implementation and looking towards, and I'll touch upon briefly at the end, the International Migrant Review Forum, which will take place in May of 2022. There is equally a Secretary General's report that is being developed and will be published in February of 2022 ahead of the IMRF, which will be then also, there will be an outcome document that will be negotiated. Next slide, please. This is as a broad overview of the 23 objectives, again, each with associated actions and commitments. And you can see there is a specific ordering of them, and it is by no small chance of the ordering of them. So for example, collect and utilize accurate and disaggregated data as a basis for evidence-based policies is indeed a negotiated text, all of which are negotiated, but the ordering also is not. And also we can note that Objective 23, which was proposed by the Comoros on behalf of the Africa Group, was also in terms of really focusing on issues surrounding of partnerships and the importance of that, equally in line with Goal 17 of the SDGs. Next slide, please. Now, equally in line with the GCM objectives are also 10 guiding principles that define the approach of the GCM as a whole, again, as a basis of people-centered, seeking in terms of international cooperation, looking to in terms of also respecting, of course, national sovereignty, human rights, seeking to be gender responsive, child sensitive, and working it through a whole of government and whole of society approach. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to touch upon two regional reviews that have taken place. In fact, there have been 5 regional reviews that have taken place ahead of at the regional level, ahead of the upcoming International Migration Review Forum. The Arab states, which comprises, or I should say, straddles that we follow that of the League of Arab States outlining of the 22 member states of the Arab League, of which also many participated in the Africa review, in fact, specifically 10. So I'll touch upon those 2 specific reviews, as well as the buildup, and then leading up until the IMRF. Now, specifically for the Arab States review, which took place in February of this past year, there was a proceedings in terms of working through or having capacity building and information sharing with member states ahead of it. So in terms of going through each of the member states, were looking at in terms of having information with regards to the voluntary national reviews. So each of the member states have been asked, or it's again a voluntary review, but to be able to report on the objectives and achievements of the voluntary national reviews. So as such, there was the capacity building through the voluntary national reviews as one step, and then following that, looking in terms of what would be the modalities of an Arab States review that would take place in subsequently in February, that took place also virtually. So just in terms of the line here, in the past over 2 years now that we've been working together with partners, specifically with the League of Arab States, as well as UNESCOA, which is the Regional Economic Secretariat, and members of the Regional Network on Migration that are 20 other UN agencies. We've worked so in terms of having a conference meeting in December 2019 here in Cairo, so now 2 years ago. This was an in-person event. Then we had, followed by that immediately, the capacity building workshop on mainstreaming of migration in the SDGs and the preparations ahead of the GCM, as followed then the 2 capacity building workshops in June and August of last year, and multi-stakeholder dialogues with, as mentioned, different stakeholders and consultations ahead of the first GCM Arab review. Equally, there were multiple other dialogues that took place with interstate consultative mechanisms, or frequently known as regional consultative processes, dialogues also with parliamentarians, stakeholder consultation with women, migrant children, and youth. And this was all in build-up in 2020 ahead of the GCM Arab States review that took place in February of 2021. Next slide, please. Equally ahead of the GCM Arab States review, there was an online survey that was opened. It was anonymous, of which to obtain information from stakeholders to know how is the GCM being achieved in the Arab region. Again, this was opened during 3 months for all relevant stakeholders for these inputs, and we received over 130 inputs and had the following findings. So the majority of respondents noted the improvement of the situation of migrants since the adoption of the GCM, although 2/3 noted that there is still a need to accelerate efforts for the implementation. Of the countries that were, or of the stakeholders that were contributing, they noted that objectives 1, 2, and 6, or areas where countries needed to make further efforts. They also further noted on the importance of an improved integration of the GCM guiding principles, working towards the whole of society and child-sensitive approach, as well as in terms of what has been done to date, looking at 4 key areas of providing direct assistance to migrants in terms of achieving the GCM implementation, providing capacity building, producing data and research, and as well as providing funding and technical support. Next slide, please. So in terms of also some of the highlights from the Arab States review, which I may just note here, most of the countries that participated noted the establishment of platforms for implementation of the GCM. There was overall considerable progress that was reported on all 23 objectives of the GCM. And specifically, as mentioned, there were 14 of the 22 Arab states that submitted their voluntary national review reports. Now, these can be, the majority can be found on the UN Network on Migration link. We'll provide that in the chat box later, where you can see the national voluntary reports that have been submitted, available in English, Arabic, and French, as well as focusing on objectives 1, 2, 10, and 23 that received the most amount of reporting of the 14 voluntary national reviews. Next slide, please. Some points here that in terms of challenges and risks that were identified, and certainly as the launch, if you will, for the GCM implementation, specifically for the regional reviews, took place in the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic that continues, of course, to still impact us as a whole. And this has also aggravated further economic and humanitarian situations, as specifically in terms of socioeconomic impact, challenges, national capacity constraints, a decline in financial revenue, and certainly as again, the negative impact of COVID-19 upon the national capacity to be able to react and respond, as well as mentioned, the continuation and resurgence of humanitarian crises. Next slide, please. Now, some of the key messages that came out of the February 2021 review was indeed that there has been concrete progress made on ensuring the UN system-wide coordination of migration. At the time, there were 10 national UN networks on migration in the Arab states and 1 regional UN network on migration. There's a focus on strengthening international, regional, and bilateral cooperation on migration, working specifically also through a whole of society approach, and a need to close the gap between the national migration plans and their implementation in practice. Next slide, please. Some of the key priorities that were identified in the Arab Regional Review was in terms of looking to how to best mitigate the impact of the pandemic through migration governance, looking at the attainment of and working towards the human rights of all migrants are observed, as in line with the GCM vision and guiding principles, a limited mutual recognition of skills, qualification, and competences, and the need to work on this further, also identifying the cost of recruitment, which continue to remain quite high, and also looking to alternatives to immigration detention. Next slide, please. Now here, in terms of, if you will, a continuation following from the GCM regional review for that in Africa, which was a continental review, there was further consultation with academia, and we did that specifically with academics from North Africa. There were then 4 roundtables that took place again with stakeholders on the four thematic areas of roundtables throughout in both months of June and July. Ahead of the GCM Regional Review for Africa, there was a regional meeting that took place, I guess, a multi-stakeholder consultation, again, ahead of the main conference that took place in the 31st of August and 1st of September. Next slide, please. Now, for the continent, there have been 24 countries that have submitted their voluntary GCM national reviews. Those are here as listed below. We will also place in the chat box, again, on the same UN Network on Migration website, the voluntary national reviews for those countries that have agreed to have been posted here. And we'll share that in a moment. Next slide, please. Ahead of the Africa Continental Review, there was a day that was dedicated to site events, and these were all virtual site events, but that took place throughout the day and hosted by a variety of different entities focusing on different areas. So such as in terms of employability of migrants, looking on issues of trafficking in person, again on migration data, governance of migration, human mobility, and African National Human Rights Institution coordination of it as a regional consultation. And these were relatively well attended and organized throughout the course of the day ahead of the GCM Regional Review for Africa. Next slide, please. Now for the conference itself, they had approximately, again, both similar, I can say actually for the Africa review as well as for the Arab review, they were streamlined on YouTube as well as made as public as possible, also with translation in English, French, and Arabic for both of the reviews. Again, had high level representation as well as a wide number of stakeholders that participated in the respective reviews. Next slide, please. So some of the recommendations from the stakeholder consultation is, again, encouraging recommendations for research initiatives, specifically on that of climate-induced migration, bilateral labor agreements, as well as that of child protection, enhancing efforts in terms of legal mobility, or legal identity, sorry, I should say rather, partnerships for safe return, anti-discrimination, amongst others, and addressing the data gap, which continues to be an important aspect, and again, addressing the objective one of the GCM. Next slide, please. So here, in terms of some of the key recommendations from the conference as a whole, was looking at to empower local communities responding to the growing migrant needs in Africa, supporting and empowering migrants and their families on migrant skills and training, ratifying and implementing key policy frameworks and protocols that relate to the rights of migrants, strengthening and regional information systems and databases, again, going back to policy and training, and amongst, sorry, and ensuring migrants, regardless of status, were able to eradicate, exercise their human rights and protection concerns. Next slide, please. So here, in terms of also looking at different areas of concern that would highlight it as here below. I'm conscious of time, so I will go a little bit faster here. Next slide, please. And then again, some of the key challenges that have been identified as a whole. Next slide, please. And sorry, yeah, so here in terms of, so if you can just go back very briefly, Amira. Thank you. So again, just briefly to note here with regards to, as was noted specifically with regards to the achievements, if you will, so already highlighting the achievements both within the context of the Arab review that was highlighted, as well as that within the context of the Africa review. So just to give some examples in terms of objectives, in terms of particular examples that have come from the voluntary national reviews. So for example, in that of objective 10, was looking at preventing and combating eradicating trafficking in person in the context of international migration. So there, if you can go kindly to the next slide. So in terms of also looking at the commitment itself, so that is that's highlighted. So looking at the commitment to take legislative or other measures to prevent and combat and eradicate trafficking in persons in the context of migration. Next slide. You can look at the objective 10 of the actions, and these are all just examples of some of the actions that can be taken. Again, they are not, these are some examples. However, there could be indeed many more of the different actions that can be taken at the local, national, regional, and global level. Next slide, please. So here, in terms of some examples of trafficking in person measure that have been taken or highlighted in the respective countries. So for example, that come from their voluntary national reviews. So for example, in Libya, the Ministry of Justice has stepped up efforts in combating smuggling and human trafficking in close coordination with UNODC, IOM, and UNICEF. Libya is currently in the process of establishing a capacity building program that could feed into law enforcement and the development of capacity of judicial bodies to deal with trafficking in persons and migrant smuggling. Equally, in coordination with IOM and other UN agencies, Mauritania revised its 2 draft laws on strengthening the transnational response to smuggling of migrants, and preventing on combating and eradicating trafficking in persons. And in July 2020, both laws were approved by the Parliament. Lastly, in the case, for example, of Morocco, it has upgraded its national legislation for the protection of migrant workers by passing new laws for fighting human trafficking. And more specifically, law number 14 to 27 includes provisions for the protection of women and children who are victims of exploitation through forced labor and servitude. Adding to this, one of the many objectives of establishment has been Moroccan Office for Refugees and Stateless Persons is to combat trafficking in persons. So again, just some examples I've taken from the voluntary national reviews of some of the achievements in the continent. Next slide, please. Lastly, looking at objective 23, looking at in terms of strengthening international cooperation and global partners for safe, orderly, and regular migration. Next slide. This is also in line with Goal 17 in terms of focusing on partnerships, and again was presented by Comoros in May 2020 during, in May 2020, May 2018 during negotiations, and looking in terms of touching upon the areas of partnerships, the 2030 agenda, the Addis Ababa action agenda, as well as looking at in terms of looking at through a holistic approach through cooperation. Next slide, please. Again, looking at some of the considerations of actions, looking to implement together aspects of the GCM, close relation to the 2030 agenda. Next slide. And here are just some of the examples from a variety of different countries that include the inclusive institutional setups and multi-stakeholder synergies from the regions, again, coming from their voluntary national reviews. So, for example, in that of Algeria, there was an interministerial committee usually in charge of migration governance, governance strategies, and chaired by the Ministry of Interior, Local Authorities, and Urban Development, was entrusted with monitoring the progress of the GCM in the Ministry of Interior, and in coordination with various ministry sectors, agencies, official institutions, including local authorities such as wilayas. Equally, I will note here also Libya has committed to advancing the conversation of the GCM provisions, goals, and objectives through a variety of ways. It has established a National Committee of Migration Strategies and Policies, which includes technical experts from various backgrounds, as well as executive and legislative actors from both the executive government branches and the Libyan House of Representatives in Tripoli. And it seeks to advance the conversation on migration governance and reinforce multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder consultations with a view to developing evidence-based policy in migration and aligning migration governance with the SDGs. And to note here specifically also that both in the case of Algeria and Libya, they were abstained to the GCM as a whole, however, have been both submitted voluntary national reviews and have been actively participating throughout the process at the regional review in terms of committing also to supporting the GCM implementation of the goals. Other examples in the case of Egypt, where we sit currently, The Prime Minister issued a decree in November 2019 to establish a national committee headed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to coordinate and follow up on implementation of the GCM in coordination with all relevant national agencies, including the Ministry of State for Immigration and Egyptian Expatriates Affairs, Ministry of Manpower, Ministry of Interior, and the National Coordinating Committee for Preventing and Combating Illegal Migration and Trafficking of Persons. And the objectives are to ensure policy coherence into mainstream migration with all existing policy areas. The National Committee reports on a regular basis its work to the Prime Minister, and to date, there's been 3 publicly drafted available reports in January, March, and July of 2020. Equally to note, in Mauritania, there was an appointment to the Ministry of Interior and Decentralization at the focal point that can follow up on the implementation of the 23 objectives. Also in Comoros, and following consultative process itself, there was the Ministry of Interior was tasked with the GCM implementation, putting in place a multi-sectoral commission that is in charge of following up on the GCM objectives. And lastly, we're indeed, but certainly not least, as some examples, on the case of Morocco, an advanced consultative intra-governmental and intra-societal mechanism was set up to follow up on the GCM adoption and implementation. And the government has drawn on already existing government mechanisms developed over the past years to monitor the implementation of the National Immigration and Asylum Strategy and the National Strategy for Moroccans Living Abroad. And my last slide that I will conclude with is that in terms of these different examples and citing that, again, this is in lineup towards the International Migration Review Forum, which will take place in May of 2022. So on May 9th, there will be a multi-stakeholder consultation, and the 10th through 13th will be the respective dialogues, roundtable dialogues that will be then with the outcome of a negotiated text and document leading to the progress declaration of the GCM as a whole. And the IOM Director General serves as the UN Network on Migration Coordinator, and it is also as the UN Network on Migration supporting the overall implementation of the upcoming International Migration Review Forum in support in close coordination with UN agencies as part to be able to support the overall implementation, follow-up and review of member states as a whole. So it is with that I will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. Apologies for the very long presentation time, and thank you for your time, and I'd be available for any questions. Thank you again, Amira, as well. Over.
Thank you very much, dear Christina. Your presentation was very, very good. There is the very important points. I just noted some of them, but it's okay. GCM, we talked about GCM implementation and the 3 objects of the GCM, GCM follow-up and the review in the Arab region, and the regional review in the Arab region. Also, the challenges of the regional review, the challenges of the implementing GCM, and also the regional review conference. You also tackled the point of the situation of African countries implementing GCM, and you also raised some examples for the best practices or some practices of Arab or African countries. So thank you very much. I just have some questions before you finish. This is like a concern for me. What is the difference between the global compact for migration and convention migrants workers? What is the difference, or the main differences between them? I also have another question. What is your evaluation about the Egyptian national strategy for communication with Egyptians abroad? How can we consider this this strategy a part of implementing the GCM goals? The last question: why some countries criticize the GCM because of the shared responsibility, especially Russia, as you know? How can we convince or persuade African countries to join GCM.
Thank you very much. I will attempt my response for that. And the third question cut out slightly, but I will respond at least, and hopefully I will say correct, or you can address it. You can correct me there.
Do you want me to raise the question again?
For the third, just for the third, I couldn't hear as well. Yes, please.
Why some countries criticize the GCM because of the shared responsibility, which is stated in the GCM, so especially Russia. You know that Russia refused to join because of the shared responsibility, which is stated in the GCM. So why? And I just wondered why.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your question. So in terms of the first question, in terms of what is the main difference, I think, for the convention and that of the GCM, the main difference is the fact that the GCM is a voluntary document. It's non-binding. It's a global international migration governance framework. It has a UN resolution. It also has been adopted by the majority of member states in Marrakesh. So 164 member states had adopted it in Marrakesh, whereby 152 had, it was adopted by UN General Assembly resolution. And that deals specifically with international migration, not internal migration. So that's just as a note, but the convention specifically for migrant workers and for families of migrant workers, a small number of countries have ratified it, approximately have been more than 15, if you will, but a very, very small number. And that is a convention, if you will, and also led by ILO in support of that. But this is both, you have the international, focusing on specifically in international migration, looking at the 360-degree approach of migration. But again, a non-binding document, which would be ultimately the key fundamental difference. The second question in terms of, for example, for that of the Egyptian policy, in terms of, yes, looking at international migration and looking at the 360-degree approach is an example. And also, as was mentioned in Objective 1, looking to obtain evidence-based data to help contribute to these policies is critically important. That of migration policies or policies for expatriates, for diaspora abroad. These are all important aspects in terms of helping giving frameworks and guidelines and opportunities for, let's say, and capitalizing on remittances for those in terms of recognizing skills, recognition, also for those that are returning from abroad. So again, I would say an example of the different migration policies, a growing number that exist in the continent and continue to be of critical support in terms of helping to enhance migration management, I would say. And the third question in terms of criticism, indeed, in terms of GCM, as was mentioned, 164 member states adopted or were by majority agreed to it, and by resolution, which is a vote at the General Assembly, which actually was called by the United States to call for a vote itself, to vote, and of which you had 152 member states that have voted for the convention, and 12 that were abstained, and 5 that were voted against. Mm-hmm. In terms of it's also in terms of itself, it's a non-binding document. It respects the national sovereignty of each country. It's also the 23 objectives, so every country can let's say adopt or the prioritization for each country as it seems best. In terms of what are priorities, 23 objectives are many. Indeed, there's also an encouragement at the during now ahead of the International Migration Review Forum for the national action plans for the GCM as a whole. So it's looking to how each country can focus on prioritizing respective objectives that are most urgent for each country. And again, the GCM implementation is at the country level or national, really it starts at the local level, national, regional, and global and international. So there has indeed been different discussions, but it fully respects the national sovereignty for each country, looking towards that. There was discussions before on different terminologies. Some countries use different terminologies and others. However, by large and majority, the majority of member states have adopted it and by vote as well. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you for the presentations and answering the questions. It was very fruitful, and I got a lot of notes. Thank you for that.